talk to you today about the Battle of Lake Borgne, which is, let's face it, it's one of the forgotten battles of the War of 1812. And the reason I think it's largely forgotten is the fact that it was an American loss. And we don't like to remember our losses like we do our victories, of course. But I want to argue that this was an example of pure, uncompromising bravery on the part of the US Navy men who fought at this battle. And that it absolutely contributed to Jackson's campaign and was absolutely instrumental in his success on Chalmette Plain on January 8. Now, the Battle of Lake Borgne, we all know, took place on December 14 of 1814. But the actual fighting and the manoeuvring began several days before that, so it almost made it like a little mini campaign of Lake Borgne. And what I'd like to do is give you a perspective on the lead up to the battle and the battle itself, and to try and do that from both an American and a British point of view. Now, most of what you're going to hear today comes directly from the accounts, and I'm talking about the letters, the journals, the official dispatches of the two men who were in charge of this campaign, who were leading the battle on either side. From the American side, that was Lieutenant Thomas Catesby Jones, who was just a 24-year-old lieutenant, and on the British side, it was Commander Nicholas Lockyer of the Royal Navy. And Lockyer was a bit older, he was about 36 years old at this stage, he'd been very successful, and since September of 1814, he'd been spending all of his time down on the Gulf Coast. So he'd really gotten to know the waters, the shifting sands, the difficulties associated with working on the Gulf officers. For Lockyer, that was Vice Admiral Sir Alexander Cochrane, who we're going to hear about next. And for Jones, that was Master Commandant Daniel Patterson. You may have heard him referred to as Commodore Patterson, or Commodore was a courtesy rank given to him as Chief of the New Orleans Station. And we'll talk more about Patterson in just a moment. Now, Cochrane, I won't go into all the details because Ron has so beautifully laid out what happened at Fort Boyer, but after the loss of Fort Boyer, Cochrane loses his ability to bring his troops in through Mobile, march them overland to Baton Rouge, and then bear down on New Orleans from upriver. He loses the chance to do that, and he's got to look for an alternative route to bring his men in to New Orleans. And he looks at the obvious approaches at coming up the Mississippi, of coming in through the west, neither of which are going to work for various reasons. And he decides that the best of a bad bunch of options is going to be to approach through Lake Borgne from the east. And in order to do that, he needs to anchor the large ships, the 74-gun ships, in a deep water anchorage off the Chandeleur Islands, and then he will take the smaller vessels, the brigs and frigates, into an inshore anchorage off of Cat Island. And then from there, they will begin this incredibly difficult task of transferring 6,000 men, this is soldiers, marines, and sailors, into these flat, open rowboats, basically, flat bottom boats. Now, in addition to the men, which is 6,000 is the size of the initial landing force, there were of course more waves of reinforcements that came in after this. But in addition to the men, there was all the materiel. There was the guns, the cannon, the ammunition, the small arms, the beer, the food, the muskets, the tents, everything they needed for this campaign had to be rowed in these boats more than 70 miles through Lake Borgne to the entrance of Bayou Catalan. That's what the British called it. That's what it was named as on all of their maps and their dispatches. Now, we of course know it as Bayou Bienvenue, and then from Bayou Bienvenue they make their way through the bayou to Chalmette, and then of course follow the river road up to New Orleans. So by late September, Cochrane is set in his plan for coming through Lake Borgne and bringing the campaign in that way. Now, the key element of this plan, obviously, was his ability to get enough of these. These are flat bottom boats that are going to be needed to transfer all the men and the material through Lake Borgne. The problem is, of course, the shallowness of Lake Borgne. Here's a lake with an average depth of 6 to 12 feet. So these were absolutely vital. And he would have enormous troubles in gathering enough of these boats to make this campaign work. and it was really going to set Cochrane on the back foot before he even began. What he did have was about 45 of these. These are ship's boats. They're tenders to the large ships, and they're variously known as barges, launches, pinnaces, gigs, jolly boats, depending on their size and their function. The problem was, when these are fully laden with 20 to 30 men and all of the material, they're going to be drawing about 6 to 8 feet of water. That's a real problem in a lake with a depth of 6 to 12 feet. Okay? So here's Cochrane. He and the first ships of the fleet, they arrive off the Chandeliers on December 8. And then the rest of the ships, all of the reinforcements, the 3,000 men coming over from the Duke of Wellington's armies in Europe, they arrive between the two anchorages around December 10 to December 12. And once they're there, they begin the process of transferring all supplies into these open rowboats, these barges. Within about a day of their arrival, 74's arrival off the Chandeliers, Patterson is alerted to their presence. He has spies working out in the Gulf. He knows that they're there, and he moves immediately to send the 5 gunboats under Jones into Lake Borgne. At this point, they're there for reconnaissance purposes. Now, Patterson has an impossibly difficult task ahead of him. Here is a man, he is charged with defending New Orleans, which is a city obviously surrounded by waterways on all sides, with a fleet of 15 vessels. That's it. That's all he had. And the largest of those vessels was the 18-gun brig Louisiana. And this is not Louisiana, but this is pretty much exactly what she would have looked like. And then the second largest vessel he had was the 14-gun schooner Carolina. So he didn't have a lot at his disposal, and on top of that he had just an eclectic variety of sloops and schooners and even a felucca, which is a Middle Eastern vessel. What he did have most of were these, the Jeffersonian gunboats. Now, obviously these are named after the president who ordered their construction, and they're a strange vessel actually. They're sloop rigged, they've got single mast, and most of them are set up with a gaff cutter rig. You could see where the gaff sail would fit right in here. And they were quite small. They had an average length of about 50-60 feet, and they were pretty squat. They had quite a wide beam, 16, 18 feet across, and very shallow draft so that they could get through coastal shallow waters for coastal navigation. What gunboats were also equipped with is pretty heavy guns. Usually they were equipped with a long gun in front and in the aft, and these were generally set up forward. But when you have heavy guns on a boat with no keel below the waterline, you've got a really rotten sailor. I mean, it was impossible to manage this thing in rough conditions, and they became really, really unmanageable in a stiff breeze. So for the most part, gunboats were useful as little more than floating inshore batteries, at least in this instance. And you can see here on the model, a lot of the gunboats were equipped with oars, stowed here on the gunnels, but we know that the boats at New Orleans did not have oars, and this would be a real problem for Lieutenant Jones later on in the campaign. He really suffered from this. Now, here's Jones. He's in command of his 5 gunboats that are sent out onto the lake. And actually the 6th gunboat, just in case you're interested, is actually sent down onto the Mississippi to reinforce Fort St. Philip. But Jones has these 5. 156 is his gunboat. Gunboats have numbers rather than names. And in addition to the gunboats, he has 2 little tenders. He's got the Alligator sloop and the Seahorse schooner. But you can see, I mean, this is not a lot of men and it's not a lot of firepower. Jones is the best equipped vessel with 41 crew. He's got 1 24-pound long gun and 4 12-pound carronades. And all up, this is 204 men and 13 long guns. That is not even the equivalent of a small British brig of war. He does not have a lot to work with. Now, Jones's orders were to reconnoitre out to Pass Christian, and if he was threatened by anything, he was to return through the Wrigley's and get under the protection of Fort Petit Coquille. Now, all of this starts, he heads on out into the lake, and on December 8 is really campaign begins. Because he's out here, he's got his gunboats, and he sends two out a little further, a little beyond Cascachian, and they actually see the British coming. They see two frigates and a brig coming down the intracoastal waterway from the direction of Mobile. And I don't know if this was boldness or stupidity, but these boats fire upon the British. These are 50-foot gunboats firing on 150-foot heavily armed British frigates. Good job. Obviously they do no damage, but the British end up chasing them back into the lake. They push these boats back. And what the British see is an additional 3 gunboats sitting there waiting for them. So when these vessels get to the inshore anchorage for the British fleet, they tell Cochrane of the presence of these 5 heavily armed gunboats in the lake with belligerent intentions. So Cochrane knows at this point that if he's going to make any progress into Lake Borgne at all, he's going to have to first eliminate the gunboats. And he sends Nicholas Lockyer in the 18-gun brig Sophie in at the head of a flotilla of 42 barges. And there were an additional 3 gigs, but the main ones we're worried about are the barges. And he's given some help. He's going to be assisted by Commander Henry Montresor and Commander Samuel Roberts. And together they'll split these barges up into 3 divisions, and they'll go in and they'll take out the Americans. Now, the order that comes from Cochrane is really important. He orders them, if at all possible, to capture the gunboats rather than destroy them. Typically, the British would just go in and destroy. That was part of the general Royal Navy MO. But Cochrane is desperately short of flat-bottom boats. He needs these vessels to make this transfer through Lake Borgne and the bayous work. So the order is to capture rather than destroy. On the afternoon of December 12, well, Cochrane's squadron is ready. His Lockyer, Montresor and Roberts, and they're at the head of their 42 barges. Now in the front of each barge is set up a carronade, either a 24, an 18 or a 12-pound carronade, depending on the size of the boat. And these were short-range guns, but they threw a hell of a lot of firepower, very powerful guns. So here what we have is about 1,200 men on the British side and 42 carronades. The 3 gigs had small arms only, so we don't really worry about them. Up against Jones with his 204 men and his 13 long guns. It was not at all a fair fight. And by the evening of December 12, Lockyer is ready. He's ready to start pushing into the lake. Now, these barges have sails, but there is no wind to help them, none at all. So they begin rowing, and these men would be rowing 36 hours later on this campaign. The following morning, well, Jones could see the British flotilla coming towards him. He could see them heading in. And from the direction that they were going, he thought that they were going to make a landing at Cascachian. But by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they've already passed that point. They're beyond there, and Jones realizes then that he is the target, that they're coming after the gunboats. And he tries at that point to withdraw. He really wants to get the boats on the western side of the Marlborough Islands here for protection. But he's stopped in his tracks by wind and by tide. And in fact, the wind was absolutely working against him. What he was faced with, the last 3 days, there had been this extreme westerly wind that had blown all of the water virtually out of Lake Borgne and into the Gulf. So the lake was extremely shallow, much shallower than usual, and 3 of the gunboats actually run aground, 156 included. And what Jones writes is that they're aground in 12 to 18 inches less water than their drafts. He's in a really bad spot. And despite throwing everything overboard that could be spared, he couldn't refloat them, and he had to just stop and wait for the tide to come back in and refloat the gunboats. Now, while the gunboats were beached, the little Seahorse schooner is right here, and she's still active. She's only got 14 men on board and 1 little 6-pound swivel gun, and she can still maneuver. So Jones decides to, this is actually not the alligator, the Seahorse, this is the alligator, but the Seahorse was very similar to this, very similar rig. He decides to make best use of this boat. She's under the command of the Sailing Master Johnson, and what he orders is for Johnson to head on into Bay St. St. Louis. There is a storehouse in Bay St. Louis full of supplies, and he doesn't want them to fall into British hands. So he says, go in, get as much of the storage as you can and get out. Well, as soon as the British see Johnson going into Bay St. Louis, they send in 3 of the barges. And there's a gunfight that ensues, and Johnson's trying to hold them off with a 6-pound gun, and there are 2 additional 6-pound guns on the shore near the storehouse, but the British respond by sending in another 4 of their barges, and so it's a complete routing. And Johnson understands at this point that he is not getting out of Bay St. Louis with the Seahorse in his possession. So what he does is he burns the storehouse, he puts his men ashore, and he burns the Seahorse to the waterline. And he does, in doing this, he deprives the British of a really valuable landing craft. There was really nothing else he could do. It was very brave action. During this cutting out expedition, Jones was able to retreat his boats to get them back sort of to the western edge of the Malheureux. And at this point, around 1 a.m. on the 14th, the wind dies, and he realizes he's not going to be able to refloat these boats before the British are upon them. So he calls his captains to a meeting, tells them how he wants them to line up, and essentially prepares for a fight. This is where they're going to make their stand. By the morning, by the first light of December 14, well, Lockyer, he finds himself at the head of an exhausted flotilla of men. These men had been rowing in teams throughout the night, and none of them had slept for more than 24 hours at this point. And he's talking about in his dispatches the fact that the morning is completely still. There's not a breath of wind to help them with the transportation through here. They're rowing still. And what he sees is the American boats lined up in what he called a close line abreast formation between Point Claire on the mainland and the Malheureux Islands. Now this line abreast formation, where the boats are lined up broadside to broadside with their bows facing straight out, this makes perfect sense with the setup of the gunboat. But all the most famous paintings of this battle, well, they've got the boats facing the wrong way. Essentially, they've got them what we call a line astern formation, where they're lined up end to end with their broadsides facing out. Well, gunboats didn't have a broadside. They didn't have gun ports like you see here. They were just a single deck with the guns on top. And again, this other painting lined up end to end, broadsides facing the British. And in this famous old map, again, they're lined up in the wrong direction. And both Nicholas Lockyer and Jones's accounts of their position and their setup confirm that these are incorrect. This is not how they were set up. They were definitely line abreast. And if you think about the setup of the boat, here you have, this would have been Jones's boat. He didn't have this aft gun. He had the forward long gun here, the 24. His carronades would have been set on the forward quarter and canted round as far as they could bear to fire straight ahead at the enemy. And he also instructed his captains to anchor with an aft anchor line. And this, of course, would have been logical in an ebbing tide to make sure the boat was facing the right way. Jones also instructs his men to set up boarding netting, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's a net that goes from the deck up into the rigging, and it was going to slow the progress of anyone coming on board. So the British would either have to cut through it or climb up and over it if they were going to take the vessel. And it gave the Americans time to repel the boarders. It was a delay tactic. Now, Lockyer and his men, they continue their advance. They continue their advance. And at about 9:30 on the morning of the 14th, Robert spots the little alligator. She's down here desperately trying to beat up against the tide to get back behind the line of Jones's gunboats. She's not very successful. She's having a hard time. And Robert sends out a couple of his barges and they take the alligator without even a fight. She has nothing to fight with. She's done. Now, at this point, Lockyer orders his men to actually stop. He stops the advance. He orders them to drop grappling hooks as temporary anchors and to eat breakfast. This might sound like a strange choice to make in the middle of a battle, but it actually was standard Royal Navy policy. If at all possible, you feed the men before a battle. And he knew this was going to be a long, hot day, not temperature hot, a hot fight. So by 10:30, they're done and they're ready to start rowing again. By this time, these British boats are pulling against a 3-knot tide. That's huge. If you ever tried to row a heavy boat against 3 knots, you would know that you're not going very far, very fast. It was really hard going. Now, Jones reports at this point that he started firing upon the British. He started throwing out shot. But he even admitted that the distance and the smallness of the British targets made his shot inviolable. He didn't hit anything. And Jones himself is at this point dealing with some pretty serious issues with the tide. And what happens is 156, his boat, and 163, George Ullett's boat, actually drag anchor to about 100 yards in advance of the American line. And this is bad. You do not want to be separated. First of all, he's broken the force of the American firing line. And second, he's exposed himself and Ullett to an early attack. He's really vulnerable out here on his own, and he certainly knows it. By 10:50 in the morning, the British flotilla was in range, and according to Jones, the enemy opened fire from the whole of his line when the action became general and destructive on both sides. And Lockyer too reports this heavy destructive fire of round and grape and canister, which ripped through his boats. I mean, these British boats have maybe 2 foot of freeboard. There's nothing there to protect these men, not from this. This is round shot, grape shot. These balls are the size of racquet balls. And canister was probably the worst of all. It's like a giant shotgun shell throwing these pellets, grape-sized pellets of lead, just mowing down these men. It was a bloody battle. By noon, after more than an hour of heavy firing, 3 of the British boats, Lockyer's barge, another barge commanded by Lieutenant Pratt, and a third barge, they closed with 156. And at that point, Nicholas Lockyer writes that this terrible fight ensued in which the bulk of the men in his boat were either killed or wounded. Now, Lockyer himself receives 3 debilitating wounds. He is in real trouble. Pratt is cut down where he stands. He dies in the scuppers of the boat. And what happens is a young midshipman named White actually jumped across and took control of the boarding party. And as he did, additional British boats are coming up on 156 to aid in the fight. Now, 156 puts up a really tough battle here. She fights tooth and claw against this. And she's doing really well. She manages to sink 2 of the British barges alongside her right where they stand. Until Jones is shot. And he's wounded pretty badly enough that he needs to leave the deck. And at that point, 156 does not have long to live as an American gunboat. At 12:10, the British come on board, they run up their own colours, and they turn the guns of 156 on her neighbouring gunboats. Now, throughout this, Montresor and Roberts are desperately trying to come up and join the action, but all that initial fighting falls on Lockyer, and the barge is immediately around him. But after 156 is taken, Montresor and Roberts and their divisions are responsible for taking the other gunboats. The whole battle has lasted just under 2 hours. Now, although the British had carried the day, their losses were fairly substantial. They had 17 killed and 77 wounded. And the Americans had only 6 killed and 35 wounded. But of course, those wounded and all the survivors are now prisoners of war. And the 5 gunboats and the Alligator are now prizes of the Royal Navy. And of course, the number of captured people actually varies. There are a lot of different reports ranging from 105 to 184. So the actual number of Americans captured at this battle is probably somewhere in between that. Now eventually, after the peace is ratified on February 16, the real end of the war, we have to remember that. Then after this, they start prisoner exchanges. And Jones and his men eventually are able to go home and able to return. And Jones has recovered from his wounds pretty well at this point. For Lockyer, well, the war was over for him. He was wounded so badly that he could not participate in any actions that took place after this. He couldn't participate in the second attack on Fort Boyer. So he was sent back to London with the dispatches announcing the failure of the British Army at New Orleans. He had a tricky task. But both he, Montresor and Roberts, they were all awarded with a promotion for their efforts at Lake Borgne. They were all made post captain on March 29, 1815. Now, poor old Jones, he had to wait some time for his promotion. He wasn't made a Master Commandant until 1820. But despite this being a loss for Jones, he definitely received just praise. And Patterson was very effusive in complimenting him, especially to superiors like the Secretary of the Navy. He wrote of Jones's gallant resistance, and he wrote in his letter to Crowninshield, he said, "The courage and skill which was displayed in defence of the gun vessels and tender for a length of time against such an overwhelming force as they had to contend with, reflects additional splendour on our naval glory and will, on trust, diminish the regret occasioned by their loss." So the real accomplishment of Jones and Patterson at the Battle of Lake Borgne was to slow the British advance, as Ron said. It slowed them down enough to give Jackson time to secure his line and to allow additional reinforcements to make their way into the city and to aid in the fight. And it really is a case of Patterson's strategic foresight and Jones's dogged bravery in the force of truly overwhelming odds that helped make the Battle of New Orleans an American victory. Thank you.
Yeah, about 9 minutes for questions, if anybody would like to. Does anybody have a question?
What's the background on Jones? Where's he from? Where's he end up?
He was from Virginia. And he had come down. He actually came from a very established family, but they had fallen on hard times. But he had some really good connections in his family that were able to get him into the Navy. The only reason he got into the officer corps, even the junior officer corps of the US Navy, is if he had good connections to back you up. He has to wait a little while, but eventually he's taken in. And he's sent down to New Orleans around 1808, I think. He's been down here for several years. And even though he called New Orleans a forlorn little station, he wasn't too impressed with being here. He actually saw some really good action down here. He was able to be involved in actions against the Baratarians, against the Spanish at Mobile in 1813, and then of course against the British. And he really was quite experienced by the time he got to be in this action at Lake Borgne. He's an interesting character, and he went on to have a bit of a checkered career after that. He was most famous, I think, for starting to fire on the Spanish at Monterey before that war had been actually declared in 1942. So he had a sort of a bit of a grey area future ahead of him, and he actually, at the very end of his career, he'd gotten very bitter about being retired from the Navy before he thought his time was up. And he starts firing off these letters to the Navy, to the Secretary of the Navy, saying, "I deserve better." His letters are quite aggressive, actually, at the end. He's an interesting character. I can tell you more about him, but see if there's any other questions. Yes, sir?
Is he any relation to Confederate Navy Casey Jones, who was on Merrimack?
I don't know a lot about the Confederate Navy, but I would say yes. I mean, that is not a common name.
He was the executive officer when Buchanan was wounded. He became the commanding officer of the Virginia on the second day.
Okay.
But his name was Casey Jones.
I'm sure it was the same family at the very least. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I want to ask again, this year what I asked you about last year here, which is Admiral Sir George Cavell, who led the British raiding party that set fire to the White House. And you said some interesting things. It was a peripheral role, but there was some kind of relevant place that he had, even though on the periphery. Or could you talk about his?
Coburn was not directly involved in the Battle of Lake Borgne. He was absolutely involved in the vessels that were working on transferring all material into the boats at Cat Island, at that inshore anchorage. He was very instrumental there, but he did not proceed with this group. Lockyer was the most senior officer in the Battle of Lake Borgne.
Where would Coburn have been at this time?
Probably on Cat Island. Yeah, the Cat Island and Pea Island became the British base of operations while they were in that area, So he was probably between Cat and Pete Island because he was overseeing a lot of the organisation of the boats and organisation of the men. So,
Exactly how did the British Marine scale a gunboat? Was there cover fire?
how would they get on board with the boarding netting?
Yeah.
Usually what they did is they cut through it. I mean, they cut through it. They would get axes, whatever they had, swords, dirks, whatever was available, and they would cut through it generally. And it was too much of a difficulty to climb overboard. These vessels they could have had sharpshooters up in them. I haven't come across any reports that there were sharpshooters in the rigging of these vessels. They could have sent a couple of men up, but as you saw, they were not very well manned. And practically every hand on board was needed on deck to fire the guns and to actually work the protection of the ship on the deck. Most of the British would not bother to try and climb up over that because they would become instant targets. So cutting through it was certainly the best way to go. And they came equipped with axes to do just that. Yes, sir.
Were the boats that the British captured then used then in the assault?
Yes, they were. They were used. They were used as transfer boats. They brought quite a lot of the British sailors through Lake Borgne. After the Battle of Lake Borgne is over and the transfer of the troops is coming to a standstill, they become vessels that are used back at the encampment area from the fishing village back to Cat Island. And they become tenders eventually to get wounded back to HMS Gorgon, which became the hospital ship for all the wounded coming out. And in fact, after the battle, Patterson makes this really odd move, and he's desperate. I mean, he's lost half of his fleet, basically. And so he sends 2 men, Shields and Morrell, one's a purser, one's a naval surgeon, with 8 men out to try and negotiate the release of all of the captives from the Battle of Lake Borgne. He sends them out to Cochrane with a letter saying, please let them go. Now, Cochrane keeps them waiting. They actually first go on board gunboat number 5, which is now under the captaincy of Captain Gordon. And they say, we want to meet with Cochrane. Well, Cochrane keeps them waiting a couple of days, but he does meet with these 2 men, and he says, no, I mean, are you crazy? Like, he couldn't believe that these men were doing this. He said, the fact that you're here is really inappropriate, and now, not only am I not going to release the prisoners, you guys, you and your 8 crewmen are now prisoners of war. And they rail against this, that it was a flag of truce, but I mean, what would Cochrane do? He's not going to release these men who are, he's about to mount this massive campaign. He's not going to release men who are the next day going to take up arms against him. So, and Morrell, the surgeon, actually ends up becoming very useful on board Borgne. He ends up helping to tend the American and the British wounded who are being treated there alongside. Now, they are released after the Battle of Chalmette, those 8 men, but the rest of the prisoners that were taken during the Battle of Lake Borgne, then they're actually taken to Havana and they're not released until after the ratification of the treaty. Yes, sir. Oh, is there someone else?
If not, what was the protocol for surrender? And was it typically respected? Was there confidence that it would be respected?
Yes and no. There are, in this case, yes, absolutely. I mean, these guys didn't have a prayer. Once the numbers of the British came up on them, there wasn't simply the ability to create a ruse de guerre and let them think they'd taken the boat and come back. That didn't happen here. The protocol would have been that the British would have run up their colours, would have run down the American colours, run up the British ensign, and that would have been the end of it. Now, there was an incident with Decatur around about the same time as this happened, where Decatur was involved in a battle with a British ship. He surrenders, he takes a beating, he runs down his colours, and at that point it was considered on both sides generally that the Americans had surrendered, the American ship had surrendered. He conducts repairs and that night tries to slip away, and does slip away. And the British are like, oh! guess it was just the most ungentlemanly, inappropriate thing to do, but he's recaptured soon after. And they definitely put the screws to him after that. Yeah.